Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Boscarino. I am a clinical neuropsychologist, and I'm here to present on inhibition for the ENIGMA-U neuropsychology lecture series. So this is an overview as to what I will discuss. So I will start with a famous case that some of you may have already heard of. I will talk about how inhibition ties into executive functioning. I will discuss the various ways in which inhibition deficits can present clinically. I will touch on the neuroanatomical correlates of inhibition. I will discuss the neuropsychological measures used to gauge inhibition and how all of the above applies clinically. So I'll start with a famous case. This person on the left is Phineas Gage. He was a 25-year-old railroad foreman who in 1848 experienced a penetrating brain injury, mainly to the frontal lobe, after an explosion led to a tamping iron penetrating that area. Now, there were no cognitive changes noted from this particular injury, and he did in fact survive, but there were some notable behavioral and personality changes that were reported after this tamping rod injury. And the injury occurred predominantly to the orbital frontal cortex. Before the injury, Phineas Gage was known as a pretty even-keeled guy. He was known actually as a pretty smart, shrewd businessman. He had done pretty well for himself, but afterwards he was described to be quite impulsive, was even described as socially inappropriate, was unable to hold down a job for an extended period of time, and essentially was described as no longer Gage, which was a major change from his pre-morbid baseline. And all of this change was, again, attributed to the damage he had sustained from his orbital frontal cortex. So this sort of sparked interest in trying to study the brain and how it could cause personality changes. So, as I alluded to before, executive functioning is an umbrella term that encapsulates kind of higher order complex thinking skills, or goal-oriented behaviors. It includes planning and most notably inhibition, organization, things that help us go to achieve a particular purpose or goal. It is often associated with the frontal lobes, but not exclusively related to frontal lobe functioning. So you can have executive dysfunction related to deficits outside the frontal lobes, though usually we see the two do tend to go hand in hand. So we do tend to see a lot more executive dysfunction from frontal lobe damage. And as you can see on the right, there are various sort of executive functions that all sort of interact with one another and rely on sort of foundational skills in other cognitive domains, such as memory, language, attention, etc. And they sort of require kind of those foundational skills to be intact in order to use those sort of executive functions. So we have to be able to remember information in order to then manipulate it in some way or use it in our working memory. Or we have to be able to understand information in order to be able to sequence it. So again, those sort of foundational skills have to be intact in order to properly subserve executive functions. And inhibition can present quite differently across three general domains of cognitive, behavioral, and motor domains. We will be focusing mainly on behavioral inhibition, but we'll touch on cognitive and motor as well. So in essence, inhibition really relates to stopping an automatic or predominant response. And cognitively, this can look more like if we were kind of filtering out extraneous information. So if we were in a restaurant and it was quite noisy, there was a lot of conversation going on around us, this would look something like filtering out that those additional noises or conversations around us. So being able to focus on just us having a conversation or talking together. If we had a cognitive inhibition deficit, we may not be able to filter out all that other extraneous information, and we may get sort of distracted by everything else that's going on around us. Behavioral disinhibition looks essentially like not being able to make good decisions, having poor judgment, or difficulty conforming to social norms. So that may look like more socially inappropriate behavior, making promiscuous or salacious remarks, not being able to regulate our own sort of emotions, that sort of thing. Now, motor behaviors or motor inhibition looks more something along the lines of perseverations or repeating the same kind of movements over and over again. So if we were kind of drawing something, maybe drawing the same line over and over again, even when we're not asked, even if we're asked to stop something. Or utilization behavior, a classic example, is if you were with a patient and you were drinking a cup of coffee and you put that cup of coffee down, if they were to then the patient were to grab it from you and take a sip from it, sort of utilizing that stuff around you, and not being able to stop yourself. So inhibition is essentially the brakes of the brain. And there are certainly a lot of distributed diffuse brain networks that contribute to behavioral inhibition. It is not just one area, but there are some neuroanatomical hubs that are deemed more critical. And one of those being the orbital frontal cortex. So the main area that Phineas Gage, we noted before, had injured from the tamping rod injury. So the orbital frontal cortex, you can see in this image, is the blue area. So it's sort of the front bottom of the brain. Another word for it is ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So ventral being the opposite of dorsal. Think of where the dorsal fin is on animals, so kind of towards the back of their body. So ventral is kind of towards the front bottom, if you will. And then medial kind of towards the middle, as opposed to lateral extending towards the ends of the brain. So ventral medial, again, another term for orbital frontal. And that's sort of the main area associated with behavioral disinhibition. Now, one of the main frontal subcortical networks associated with behavioral disinhibition and the orbital frontal cortex is this particular sort of network over here. I won't go into it in depth, but the main thing to take away from this is that there's 4 different major hubs of that particular frontal subcortical network. So it's not just the frontal area kind of working by itself. And there are a bunch of frontal subcortical networks kind of like this one, and they all follow this certain pattern. So they have a cortical area, a striatal area, a pallidal or pallidus area, and then a thalamus that kind of loops back to the cortical area. And so damage in any one of these areas can affect that network connectivity and can lead to similar problems within that network, such as potentially behavioral disinhibition or impulse control problems. So this is another major network that plays an important role in behavioral disinhibition and even decision making. So in red, you can see the uncinate fasciculus. This is a major white matter tract that connects the orbital frontal cortex to the anterior temporal lobe, and specifically, we see connections to the amygdala. So the amygdala is often thought to be one of the major hubs of the brain that relates to emotional appraisal. And the reason why this network is so important in disinhibition or inhibition kind of behaviors is that there are many theories that suggest, and even hypotheses that suggest, that emotions and kind of our appraisal of emotions actually plays a very big role in terms of how we make decisions. So oftentimes, if we have a decision at play, and we have some information in front of us, and our cognitive processes are overwhelmed, we sort of rely on our emotions or our physical sensations related to that. So if we are feeling anxious and we start to feel, our heart rate start to increase, we start to get butterflies in our stomach, or we get kind of nauseous, that may give us that anxiety or those anxiety signals that lead us away from making potentially a bad decision or impulsive choice. And so some of the hypotheses related to that are the somatic marker hypothesis, by Antonio Damasio, and the James Lange theory, that sort of suggests that those emotional cues help us to make decisions. And so when we have damage in either the anterior temporal lobes or the orbital frontal cortex, or even within the uncinate fasciculus, we can see problems with impulsive decision-making in that vein. Some of the common neuropsychological measures used, so we'll focus on two here. There are several others, but the two that we'll focus on are the Stroop and the Iowa gambling test. So on the right side of this screen, you'll see that there are some colors, and kind of they have different color inks. So the Stroop test is actually a better test of cognitive inhibition. It doesn't really correlate too well with behavioral disinhibition or inhibition. And it doesn't really correlate either well with orbital frontal functioning. But nonetheless, it is a pretty common test associated with cognitive inhibition. And you'll see on the right, the first part, folks are often asked to essentially read either the color or the color of the ink. So in this case, it's pretty easy. The red ink is paired with the word red. So reading that would not be as difficult of a task. But when you get to the bottom, usually patients are asked to read the color of the ink rather than the actual word. Which then requires sort of some cognitive inhibition to filter out the irrelevant information or the predominant urge to want to read purple as opposed to the actual color of the ink, which is green. The other common test used to measure inhibition is the Iowa gambling test. So you can see over on the center of the screen, there's essentially 4 decks of cards, and patients are asked to pick one of the decks, and essentially they're told if they win money or lose money, and the goal is to keep as much money as possible. So folks who have behavioral disinhibition problems find that they end up losing more money because they tend to make riskier decisions, whereas those who have good inhibition and good impulse control tend to be able to keep more money but make less risky decisions. And that tends to correlate much better with orbital frontal functioning. Some of the other neuropsychological measures are other sort of behavioral measures. We tend to use more informant measures. So if a caregiver, a family member is accompanying the patient to the visit and we're concerned about disinhibition, we'll oftentimes ask that other person to fill out some forms, some of these behavioral measures. Oftentimes when patients have behavioral disinhibition, they may not have insight or awareness of the deficit. So it's really important to get a reliable collateral information or reliable informant caregiver to help kind of shed some light onto what may be going on behaviorally. So these are some clinical examples as to how behavioral disinhibition can present. As you can see, it can present in a lot of different ways. So some examples are the patient who comes up to you and tells you that they don't like the color of your tie and they don't like your haircut, or they get very close into your personal space without realizing it. They may make sort of salacious comments or other sort of sexual remarks or inappropriate jokes throughout, get aggressive or kind of fly off the handle, have some trouble regulating their emotions or anger. All of these things are kind of common examples of how this sort of disinhibition may present. So oftentimes, these patients may present quite normally with regard to neuropsychological performance. So their testing may reveal that their scores are within normal limits on memory, even other aspects of executive functions, including cognitive inhibition. But their behavioral observations, so seeing them in the clinic, they may exhibit kind of some of these behaviors. Those can be kind of more telltale signs sometimes rather than our cognitive tests. And so the relevance of inhibition deficits, so executive dysfunction such as disinhibition can more significantly impede activities of daily living. So being able to manage finances, being able to drive, deficits in inhibition can cause more kind of problems day to day than memory problems or even problems with language. We oftentimes see that these patients and their caregivers are more distressed because oftentimes they have come into more financial problems or legal issues. So it's really important to be aware of this and accurately measure and have insight into kind of what's going on. And for treatment purposes, be aware of what may be causing it. If there's a particular trigger that's leading up to it or an antecedent, if there's, potentially something that is what we can do to prevent that, if they're having trouble regulating either kind of their new onset use of drugs or addiction, something that we can do to try to prevent kind of their means to that particular impulse control disorder or inhibition deficit. We want to look out for that sort of stuff. And it truly does have pretty strong clinical implications in that vein. So that is all that I have for you. Thank you very much for listening, and best of luck.